The morning of October 15th arrived in Columbus, Ohio, with the kind of autumn weather that seemed to mirror the melancholy of the occasion. A thick fog had settled over the city during the pre-dawn hours, obscuring the tops of the downtown buildings and casting everything in shades of gray and shadow. The sun, when it finally began to rise, did so reluctantly, as if even nature itself understood the gravity of what was about to unfold in the courthouse on High Street. Inside the imposing stone building that had witnessed countless legal battles over more than a century, Courtroom 7B was being prepared for what would become one of the most consequential cases of Judge Patricia Morrison's 30-year career on the bench. Judge Morrison arrived at her chambers at 7:30 a.m., exactly 2 hours before the hearing was scheduled to begin. She carried with her a thick file folder marked Case 2024 CV098765 in bold black letters. Inside this folder lay the detailed documentation of a child suffering, medical reports, social worker assessments, photographs of a deplorable living environment, and the heart-wrenching notes from multiple professionals who had attempted to work with a 3-year-old girl named Emma Marie Patterson. Judge Morrison had been a judge long enough to develop a certain emotional callousness, a necessary armor against the endless parade of human tragedy that crossed her docket. Yet, as she reviewed Emma's file for what must have been the 100th time, she found that armor cracking. The courtroom itself was a study in intimidation and authority. High ceilings stretched upward, adorned with classical architectural details that spoke of order, justice, and the weight of the law. The judge's bench sat elevated on a platform, positioning the judge literally above everyone else in the room, a physical manifestation of judicial authority. The wood was dark and polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the fluorescent lights overhead in harsh glints. The witness stand sat to the right, separated from the gallery by a low wooden gate. This was the stage upon which the most consequential moments of people's lives would play out. For many, entering this room felt like stepping into the belly of some institutional beast designed to judge, measure, and ultimately determine one's fate. On this particular morning, the courtroom would fill with a complex web of professionals, each with their own stake in the outcome. Court-appointed guardian ad litem Patricia Hoffman would be there, her role to represent Emma's best interests independent of all other parties. 2 social workers from the Department of Children and Family Services would attend, the case manager who had first documented the abuse and the supervisor who had authorized Emma's removal. A child psychologist would present testimony about Emma's psychological state. Emma's biological parents would be present with their court-appointed defense attorney, ready to argue that the allegations against them were exaggerated, that they were victims of an overzealous social services system, that their child had been wrongfully taken from them. The prosecutor's office would have a representative there, though this wasn't technically a criminal case. It was a civil matter determining custody and the child's future. But the most striking presence in the courtroom would be Emma herself. She sat in a chair specially arranged for her, positioned so she could see the judge but wouldn't feel completely exposed to the entire gallery. She was small for her age, a consequence of months of malnutrition, with wispy blonde hair that had been carefully braided by her temporary guardian. She wore a simple pink dress, chosen specifically to make her feel more comfortable, less like she was on trial. Her shoes, purchased new just for this day, barely reached the floor. Her dolls had been found in her apartment, filthy and broken, and she would be allowed to hold one today for comfort. But nothing could truly comfort her. Nothing could make this experience less traumatic, because Emma Patterson hadn't spoken a single word in approximately 4 months. This silence was not natural childhood shyness. It was not a developmental delay or a speech impediment. It was the profound silence of a traumatized child whose psychological response to overwhelming abuse was complete withdrawal from verbal communication. She communicated through gestures and expressions, through nods and head shakes. She could be heard making small sounds, whimpering at night, crying when she was hurt, but intentional speech had vanished from her behavioral repertoire entirely. Multiple professionals had evaluated her. Dr. Michael Torres, a pediatric neurologist, had ruled out any physical causes. Dr. Sarah Chen, a child psychologist specializing in trauma, had conducted extensive evaluations and concluded that Emma's silence was a psychological response to severe emotional and physical abuse. The case details were disturbing in their specificity. Emma had been discovered on a cold January morning when Officer David Ramirez responded to a welfare check requested by her school. The pre-K program had grown concerned when Emma hadn't attended for 2 weeks and when her teacher's attempts to reach the parents had been unsuccessful. What Officer Ramirez found in apartment 3B of the Riverside Towers building on the south side of Columbus was something that would haunt him for years. The apartment was filthy beyond description. Spoiled food rotted on the kitchen counter. Empty beer bottles and drug paraphernalia littered the living room. The heating system had been broken for weeks, and it was 18 degrees outside. Emma had been found in a bedroom wearing only a thin t-shirt and a diaper that hadn't been changed in what appeared to be over 24 hours. She was malnourished, dehydrated, and covered in unexplained bruises at various stages of healing. Now in this courtroom, Judge Morrison faced an impossible situation. The evidence of abuse was overwhelming: medical documentation, photographic evidence of the living conditions, the testimony of multiple professionals. Yet Emma's inability to speak meant that the most powerful evidence, the child's own voice describing what happened, was absent. The defense attorney was preparing to argue that without Emma's direct testimony, the case was circumstantial, that her parents' explanations for the bruises might be legitimate, that the deplorable living conditions were simply the result of poverty and temporary hardship, not intentional abuse. The clock on the courtroom wall showed 8:47 a.m. 13 minutes remained before the hearing would begin. Judge Morrison sat in her chambers, her hand resting on Emma's file, and she made a decision that would change everything. Detective Marcus Webb had been a police officer for 17 years, but it was only in the last 7 that his career had truly found its purpose. For the first decade, he'd been a standard patrol officer, responding to calls, writing reports, and performing the mundane but necessary duties that keep a city functioning. He'd been competent at his job, never remarkable, never problematic, a solid middle-of-the-road cop who did what was asked and collected his paycheck. But 7 years ago, everything changed when he was assigned to work with a German Shepherd puppy named Ranger at the Columbus Police Department's K-9 unit. The assignment had seemed routine at the time. Webb was told he would be trained to work with police dogs, and he would participate in standard K-9 operations, narcotics detection, building searches, suspect apprehension. But from the moment Webb met Ranger, something shifted in his understanding of what police work could be. Ranger was different from other police dogs. While most K-9s were bred and trained for aggression, for tracking, for subduing suspects, Ranger had been selected through a rigorous program for different qualities entirely: empathy, emotional intelligence, and an almost preternatural ability to sense and respond to human distress. Ranger's lineage was remarkable. His mother had been imported from Germany, a dog with an unusual genetic predisposition toward what animal behaviorists called emotional mirroring, the ability to sense and respond to the emotional states of humans around them. His father was a trauma response dog who had worked with the FBI's Victim Services Division. When Ranger was born, breeders and trainers at the National Center for Victims of Crime had immediately identified him as a candidate for their most specialized program, the Trauma Response K-9 Initiative. For 2 years, Ranger underwent training unlike any standard police dog program. His handlers didn't teach him to attack or apprehend. Instead, they taught him to recognize signs of human distress, elevated heart rates, stress-related body odors, trembling, tears. They taught him to approach suffering people with gentleness rather than force. They conditioned him to remain calm in chaotic environments, to provide steady, grounding physical presence to people in crisis. Trainers worked with child psychologists to develop protocols for how Ranger should interact with traumatized children. Every movement was calculated to convey safety rather than threat. His body language was taught to be open, non-aggressive, and emotionally available. When Ranger completed his training at 2 years old, he was certified not just as a police dog, but as a victim advocate. His credentials included certifications from the National Center for Victims of Crime, the American Psychological Association's Trauma Division, and specialized training from the International Association of Canine Professionals. He was, essentially, a furry therapist with a badge. Marcus Webb's role evolved accordingly. While other K-9 handlers spent their days tracking suspects through neighborhoods or searching buildings for hidden criminals, Webb found himself responding to a different kind of call. When a child had been sexually abused and needed to give testimony, Webb would be called. When a domestic violence victim was too frightened to speak to authorities, Webb would bring Ranger. When elderly residents had been scammed or exploited and were traumatized by the violation, Ranger would sit with them, his warm body against their trembling legs, until they found courage enough to report their abusers. Over the 7 years working together, Webb and Ranger had developed a partnership that transcended the typical handler-dog relationship. They communicated with glances and subtle gestures. Webb could read Ranger's body language with such precision that he knew exactly when his partner had sensed someone's distress before that person even realized it themselves. Ranger, in turn, seemed to understand Webb's intentions with an almost telepathic clarity. They moved through traumatized situations like a choreographed dance, each knowing their role, each supporting the other. The statistics spoke for themselves. Prior to Ranger's arrival at the Columbus Police Department, the Victim Services Division had successfully obtained testimony from traumatized child witnesses in approximately 43% of cases. With Ranger's presence in interviews and courtroom proceedings, that number had jumped to 87%. 63 children had found their voices with Ranger's help. 54 abusers had been convicted with testimony that had been made possible by the presence of this extraordinary dog. Ranger's physical appearance reinforced his effectiveness. At 85 pounds, he was large enough to command respect and attention, yet his features were gentle. His German Shepherd heritage gave him an aristocratic bearing, but his dark brown eyes, held an expression of such profound compassion that even people hardened by trauma found themselves softening in his presence. His coat was meticulously maintained, brushed daily until it gleamed. He wore a special vest that identified him as a Victim Services dog, and his badge collar was a source of pride for Webb, who made sure it was polished and presentable for every assignment. But beyond the physical attributes and the training, what made Ranger truly exceptional was his emotional intelligence. He seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of human psychology that defied easy explanation. When someone was frightened, he would approach slowly and position himself at their level. When someone was angry, he would maintain a calm, centered presence that seemed to gradually lower the person's agitation. When someone was grieving, he would lean against them, offering the simple comfort of unconditional physical presence. Child psychologists who had worked with Ranger theorized that he had an almost supernatural ability to detect the subtle biochemical signals of human emotion, the pheromones released during stress, the changes in vocal tone and breathing patterns that accompanied fear or sadness. Whatever the mechanism, the results were undeniable. Children who hadn't spoken in months would whisper to Ranger. Assault survivors who couldn't articulate their trauma to human therapists would break down in tears while touching Ranger's coat, as if the dog's presence gave them permission to finally release the emotional dam they'd been holding. Elderly residents who had lost faith in their fellow humans would trust Ranger with their stories, finding in his consistent, non-judgmental presence a kind of redemption. Webb had received numerous commendations for his work with Ranger. The FBI had approached him about transferring to a National Victim Services program. Universities had invited him to speak about victim advocacy. But Webb remained committed to Columbus, to the community where he and Ranger had built their reputation. He lived modestly, devoted his life to the work, and took immense pride in the small miracles that occurred when his dog walked into a room full of pain. On the morning of October 15th, as Webb prepared Ranger for the hearing in courtroom 7B, he brushed his partner's coat with the same careful attention he always employed. He spoke to Ranger softly, explaining what they would face that day. "We've got a little girl who needs us today, buddy," Webb said, his hand moving through Ranger's fur. "She's been through a lot and she doesn't know how to ask for help yet, but I think you know what to do." Ranger looked up at Webb, his eyes bright with understanding, and together they prepared to walk into a courtroom that had no idea what they were about to accomplish. The circumstances that had brought Emma Patterson to the attention of Child Protective Services were both ordinary and horrifying. A depressingly common story of how systemic failures, parental dysfunction, and sheer human cruelty could conspire to destroy a child's most fundamental needs for safety and love. Understanding the full complexity of Emma's case required tracing back through months of missed opportunities, ignored warning signs, and a family system so broken that it seemed almost miraculous that the child had survived at all. Emma's mother, Jennifer Patterson, was 34 years old and had been struggling with substance abuse since her early 20s. She had grown up in poverty, in a home where her own parents had provided minimal supervision and guidance. She had become pregnant with Emma at 29, initially with hopes that motherhood would provide direction and purpose to her chaotic life. For the first year, Jennifer had tried. She attended prenatal appointments, prepared a nursery, and spoke about her dreams of being a good mother. But the reality of parenthood, combined with her ongoing addiction struggles, had proven overwhelming. By Emma's first birthday, Jennifer had returned to regular drug use. By Emma's second birthday, she had ceased any pretense of maintaining the household. Emma's biological father, Robert Chen, had disappeared from their lives when Emma was 18 months old. He had never been married to Jennifer, and when Jennifer told him she was pregnant, he had made it clear he wanted no involvement. After his departure, Jennifer had cycled through a series of boyfriends, each one representing a different flavor of toxicity. Some were physically abusive toward Jennifer herself. Some were indifferent to Emma's existence. One, a man named Derek Voss, who had lived with them for 11 months, had been suspected by neighbors of physical abuse toward Emma, though Jennifer had always defended him and refused to cooperate with any investigation. The apartment where Emma had been living with Jennifer was located in the Riverside Towers, a decaying public housing complex on Columbus's south side. The building itself was a monument to neglect, broken windows, graffiti-covered walls, a pervasive smell of mold and decay. Emma's unit, apartment 3B, was on the third floor and had been in a state of accelerating deterioration. The heating system had been broken since November of the previous year. Maintenance complaints filed by Jennifer had been ignored by the landlord, a property management company more interested in collecting rent than maintaining livable conditions. When Officer David Ramirez had entered that apartment in January following the welfare check, he had documented conditions that would later be described in official reports as unsuitable for human habitation, particularly for a small child. The kitchen was filthy. The refrigerator contained only spoiled food and beer. The living room served as what appeared to be a drug use area, with evidence of heroin consumption scattered across the furniture and floor. The bathroom had not been properly cleaned in weeks. The bedroom where Emma had been found was perhaps the worst, a cold, dark space with a broken window covered with duct tape, a thin mattress on the floor with soiled bedding, and a closet containing almost no clean clothing. Emma herself had presented as severely malnourished, weighing only 32 pounds at 3 years and 2 months old, a weight typical of a healthy 1-year-old. She was dehydrated, her lips chapped and her eyes sunken. Her diaper had been unchanged for an extended period, and she had developed a serious diaper rash that was raw and bleeding in places. Most alarmingly, her small body bore evidence of trauma. She had a spiral fracture on her left arm that radiology confirmed was approximately 4 weeks old. She had extensive bruising on her torso in various stages of healing. She had small circular marks on her back that appeared consistent with cigarette burns. A gynecological examination, conducted with appropriate sensitivity by a specialized pediatric nurse, suggested possible sexual abuse. The emergency removal of Emma had been straightforward in terms of child protection protocol, but Jennifer Patterson had challenged the custody determination. She had hired a defense attorney, paid for through a public defender program, who immediately began building a narrative of overreach and misunderstanding. Jennifer's attorney, a woman named Rebecca Sutherland who had built a career defending parents against Child Protective Services, constructed a defense that had several components. First, she argued that the bruises could be explained by normal childhood accidents. 3-year-olds fall, she claimed. They run into furniture. They get injured. The fact that Emma had bruises didn't necessarily indicate abuse. She suggested that some of the bruises might have been from before Emma was removed. They could heal at different rates, she argued, so multiple bruises at various stages could simply represent multiple accidents over months, not systematic beating. Second, she challenged the spiral fracture diagnosis. She brought in an orthopedic surgeon who testified that spiral fractures, while often associated with abuse, could theoretically result from accidents, particularly if a child fell while their arm was twisted underneath them. It was uncommon for accidental spiral fractures in children, but not impossible, the expert admitted under questioning. Third, regarding the alleged sexual abuse, Sutherland pointed out that the examination had been inconclusive. The pediatric gynecologist had stated that the findings were consistent with possible abuse, but not definitive. Healing could create ambiguous findings, the expert testified. Without definitive proof, Sutherland argued, it would be inappropriate to make accusations of sexual abuse. Fourth, she presented Jennifer as a struggling but loving mother dealing with poverty and substance abuse issues that were medical problems rather than character flaws. She argued that Jennifer's addiction should be treated as a disease requiring medical intervention, not as evidence of parental unfitness. She suggested that, with proper treatment, Jennifer could be a suitable parent. Fifth, and perhaps most critically, she pointed out that Emma's testimony, or rather lack thereof, meant there was no clear victim narrative. Emma couldn't testify to what had happened. She couldn't identify her abuser. She couldn't describe specific incidents. Without the child's own voice confirming abuse, Sutherland argued, the case relied entirely on circumstantial evidence and expert interpretation. And circumstantial evidence, she reminded the court, was a much lower standard than the clear and convincing evidence typically required in custody matters. This last point was the crux of the problem that Judge Morrison faced. The medical evidence was compelling. The photographs of the apartment were damning. The testimony of social workers and medical professionals was thorough and professional. But there was something missing, the human element, the victim's own voice, the child's own testimony about what she had experienced. Emma's silence had become a legal weapon in her parents' defense. It created reasonable doubt. It allowed attorneys to construct alternative narratives. It meant that while everyone in the courtroom suspected terrible abuse, suspicion was not the same as proof, and the law required more than suspicion to permanently remove a child from parental custody. Judge Morrison understood the stakes perfectly. If she ruled in favor of the parents based on insufficient evidence, Emma would be returned to a dangerous environment and likely face escalated abuse. If she ruled in favor of the state based on circumstantial evidence, she might be overturning parental rights in a way that could be challenged on appeal. The law existed in an uncomfortable space between protecting children and protecting parental rights. And Emma's silence had created a legal vacuum that seemed impossible to fill. The courtroom waited. The question hung unspoken but present in every person's mind. How could a 3-year-old girl who couldn't speak possibly defend herself in a legal system designed by adults, for adults, where testimony and evidence and argument were the currency of justice? How could a traumatized child overcome not just her own psychological wounds, but also the structural limitations of a legal system that had no adequate mechanism for her voice? The morning of the hearing arrived with a sense of inevitability, as if the courthouse itself had been holding its breath waiting for this moment. Judge Morrison had made her decision in the pre-dawn hours, unable to sleep, wrestling with the ethical and legal implications of what she was about to do. At 6:47 a.m. she had called Detective Webb at home, knowing from his personnel file that he was an early riser. The phone call had been brief and direct. "I need Officer Ranger in my courtroom this morning," she had said. "I need him present during Emma Patterson's hearing. Can you make that happen?" Webb had responded without hesitation. "We'll be there, Your Honor." By 8:30 a.m., Detective Marcus Webb stood outside courtroom 7B with Ranger at his side, both of them mentally and physically prepared for what would transpire inside. Webb had taken extra time that morning to ensure Ranger was in perfect condition. He had brushed the dog's coat until it shimmered, polished his badge collar until it gleamed, and reviewed in his mind the protocols they would follow. Ranger stood calmly, his 4 paws evenly distributed, his body language radiating the kind of peaceful centeredness that came from a dog who understood his purpose. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was already tense by the time the hearing officially began at 9:00 a.m. The gallery was nearly full. Media representatives sat in the back. Though Judge Morrison had issued strict orders limiting what could be reported, nothing that would identify Emma or expose details that could harm her. Jennifer Patterson sat at the defense table wearing a black dress, her face a study in controlled anxiety. Next to her sat Rebecca Sutherland, the defense attorney, dressed in a sharp gray business suit, her legal pads and documents arranged with the precision of someone preparing for battle. On the opposite side of the courtroom sat the prosecutor's representative, along with Emma's court-appointed guardian, Patricia Hoffman, a woman in her 60s whose career had been dedicated to advocating for children's welfare. Emma herself sat in her small chair, positioned at an angle where she could see the judge but wasn't directly exposed to the entire courtroom gallery. Her temporary guardian, a foster care worker named Maria Gonzalez, sat beside her. Emma wore her pink dress and held a small doll that had been given to her as a comfort object. Her small feet swung slightly, not quite reaching the floor. Her eyes darted around the room with the hypervigilance of a traumatized child in an unfamiliar environment. She was holding Maria's hand so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Judge Morrison entered from her chambers at exactly 9:00 a.m., the bailiff announcing her presence with the traditional all rise. Everyone in the courtroom stood as the judge took her elevated position at the bench. She surveyed the room with the practiced eye of someone who had seen thousands of cases unfold in this space. Her expression was grave, her bearing authoritative but not unkind. "Before we begin," Judge Morrison said, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority throughout the room, "I want to address a matter that is not standard procedure, but which I believe is necessary in this case. The court has determined that the presence of a trained victim services dog may help facilitate a more appropriate emotional environment for the minor child in question. Detective Webb and Officer Ranger are present for this purpose. Is there any objection from the defense?" Rebecca Sutherland stood immediately, her legal instincts triggering alarm. "Your Honor, I must object. The presence of an animal in the courtroom could be seen as prejudicial to my client. The jury—" She paused, catching herself. This was not a jury trial. The court might be unduly influenced by an emotional response to the animal's presence. Judge Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ms. Sutherland, this is a bench trial. My judicial training allows me to separate emotional responses from legal analysis. The dog is not being introduced as evidence. The dog is present to provide comfort and emotional support to a traumatized 3-year-old child who must be present in these proceedings. I'm not asking for your permission. I'm informing you of my decision. The dog stays. Now, let's proceed. The courtroom settled into an uncomfortable silence. Sutherland sat back down, her face flushed with the anger of being overruled so directly. She would make a note of this, potential grounds for appeal if the decision went against her client. Judge Morrison turned her attention to the proceedings. The prosecutor's representative began presenting evidence first: medical reports, photographs of the apartment, testimony from the pediatrician who had examined Emma upon her removal. A social worker described the conditions under which Emma had been found, speaking in clinical but vivid detail about the deplorable state of the apartment, the evidence of drug use, the indicators of abuse and neglect. Throughout all of this, Emma sat rigidly in her chair, her eyes occasionally glancing toward the witness stand where adults spoke about her suffering. She didn't understand most of what was being said, but she understood the emotional tenor of the room. She understood that she was the subject of intense scrutiny. Her breathing had become shallow, and Maria Gonzalez had to gently squeeze her hand repeatedly, whispering quiet reassurances. Then Rebecca Sutherland stood to present the defense case. She called Jennifer Patterson to the stand, and Emma's mother walked across the courtroom in her black dress, looking for all the world like someone attending a funeral rather than fighting to reclaim custody of her daughter. Jennifer's testimony was carefully crafted. She acknowledged her struggles with addiction. She presented herself as someone seeking help. She offered explanations for the bruises and the apartment conditions. She cried at appropriate moments. She spoke about her love for her daughter. She painted a picture of a flawed but fundamentally decent person caught in circumstances beyond her control. As Jennifer testified, something remarkable began to happen. Emma, who had been sitting rigidly, began to show signs of increasing distress. Her breathing became more rapid. Her eyes widened slightly. Her grip on Maria's hand intensified to the point where Maria was concerned the child might hurt herself. Emma's small body began to tremble visibly. Judge Morrison noticed. The prosecutor noticed. Patricia Hoffman, Emma's guardian, noticed. Even Rebecca Sutherland, focused on her client's testimony, couldn't help but notice the child's escalating anxiety. The courtroom's emotional temperature shifted. Everyone could feel Emma's distress, though none of them understood its precise cause, whether it was seeing her mother, or hearing her mother's voice, or something deeper in Emma's traumatized psyche that responded to the disconnect between Jennifer's calm testimony and Emma's own lived experience. Maria leaned down to Emma and whispered something, but Emma shook her head violently. Her small body was shaking now, visible tremors that spoke of an internal struggle of tremendous magnitude. She looked like she might have a panic attack. Judge Morrison was about to call a recess when Detective Webb, who had been standing at the back of the courtroom with Ranger, made a subtle movement. He guided Ranger forward, not aggressively, not suddenly, but with the calm purposefulness that characterized all of his movements with his partner. As they moved through the courtroom, heads turned. The bailiff started to object, but Judge Morrison raised her hand, indicating silence. Webb positioned Ranger near Emma's chair. The dog didn't approach directly. Instead, he simply sat, his body angled so that he was close enough to Emma but not so close as to overwhelm her. Ranger's presence was calm, centered, utterly without threat or demand. He simply existed in that space beside her, asking nothing of her, offering only his steady presence. Emma's trembling began to slow. Her eyes, which had been wide with panic, shifted from her mother's face to Ranger's face. The dog sat perfectly still, his dark eyes meeting hers with an expression of such profound understanding that it seemed impossible a dog could communicate so much with a simple look. The entire courtroom had gone absolutely silent. The court reporter's fingers had stopped moving over the keys. Rebecca Sutherland had stopped mid-sentence. Jennifer Patterson had turned to look at what had captured everyone's attention. All eyes in the courtroom were on the small girl and the large dog, watching to see what would happen next. The moment stretched out, suspended in time, as if the entire courtroom had collectively held its breath and forgotten to exhale. Emma and Ranger existed in their own universe, separated from the legal proceedings and adult agendas swirling around them. Detective Webb remained motionless, understanding intuitively that any movement from him would break the delicate connection forming between child and dog. Judge Morrison, from her elevated position, watched with the intensity of someone who had just witnessed something extraordinary beginning to unfold. Emma's breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to slow. Her small chest, which had been heaving with the physical manifestations of panic, gradually returned to a more normal rhythm. The trembling that had consumed her tiny frame began to diminish, replaced by a strange kind of stillness. Her eyes remained fixed on Ranger's face, searching in that canine expression for something she needed desperately to find. Perhaps safety, perhaps understanding, perhaps the simple knowledge that she was not alone in her terror. Ranger, for his part, performed his role with the kind of mastery that came from years of training and an almost supernatural emotional intelligence. He did not approach Emma aggressively or excitedly. He did not attempt to climb into her lap or demand attention. Instead, he maintained a perfect stillness, his body language completely open and non-threatening. His ears were relaxed. His tail lay gently on the courtroom floor. His mouth was slightly open in what could only be described as a gentle expression. Every signal his body sent was one of acceptance and safety. Maria Gonzalez, Emma's temporary guardian, watched this interaction with a mixture of amazement and recognition. She had been trained in trauma-informed care, and she understood what was happening on a psychological level. Emma's nervous system, which had been in a state of hyperarousal triggered by seeing and hearing her mother, was beginning to regulate. Ranger's calm presence was providing what neuroscientists called co-regulation, the process by which one person's calm nervous system could help calm another's. In this case, one dog's calm nervous system was having a profound effect on a traumatized child's ability to manage her own fear response. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, Emma did something that made several people in the courtroom exhale in visible relief. She raised her small hand, her tiny arm extending toward Ranger with a deliberateness that suggested this gesture required enormous courage. Her fingers, which had been clenched into a fist, began to uncurl. Her hand trembled slightly as it moved through the air between her and the dog. Ranger allowed the contact. Emma's palm made connection with Ranger's fur, her small hand disappearing almost completely into the thick, soft coat. Her fingers began to move, stroking the dog's shoulder with a gentleness that seemed incongruous with her earlier panic. It was a gesture that spoke of a child reaching out, a child seeking comfort, a child discovering that in this vast and terrifying courtroom, there was at least one being who could be trusted, who asked nothing of her except her presence. Judge Morrison's expression had softened considerably. She had seen many things in her 30 years on the bench, but she had never witnessed a child find such visible relief in the presence of an animal. She glanced at the prosecutor's representative and saw tears in the woman's eyes. Patricia Hoffman, Emma's guardian, was openly crying, her hand covering her mouth. Even the court reporter seemed to be struggling with her professional objectivity. Her hands still poised over her keyboard, but her gaze fixed on the scene unfolding before her. Rebecca Sutherland's face, by contrast, had gone pale. She understood what was happening. She understood that something fundamental had shifted in the courtroom's emotional landscape. The carefully constructed narrative she had been building, the narrative of a struggling but fundamentally decent mother, of ambiguous evidence, of a traumatized child whose silence made determination impossible, was being undermined by this single moment of genuine human connection between a child and a dog. Jennifer Patterson's face had crumpled. She was staring at her daughter touching the dog with an expression that was difficult to read. Was it remorse, regret, understanding of what she had done to this child? Or was it simply shock at seeing her daughter respond with such profound relief to something other than her own mother's presence? Whatever emotion crossed her features, it was clear that something had shifted inside her as well. Maria Gonzalez, seeing that Emma had found a source of comfort, made a subtle decision. She loosened her grip on Emma's hand slightly, allowing the child more freedom to interact with Ranger. Emma immediately buried her face in the dog's fur, her small body pressing against Ranger's side. It was a gesture of complete surrender to the comfort being offered, a child finally allowing herself to rest against something safe. And then, in the profound silence of that courtroom, something even more extraordinary happened. Emma's voice emerged, small, tentative, barely above a whisper, but unmistakably present. The words came out muffled against Ranger's fur, but they were audible to everyone in the room, especially to the court reporter who immediately began transcribing what she was hearing. "Help me." 2 words. 2 small words that had been locked inside this child for 4 months. 2 words that broke through the silence like light breaking through absolute darkness. 2 words that transformed everything. The courtroom erupted, not in noise, but in a kind of internal explosion of emotion that manifested in visible reactions. Patricia Hoffman gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. The prosecutor's representative put her head in her hands. Maria Gonzalez's eyes widened in shock. Judge Morrison leaned forward, her judicial composure cracking visibly as she processed what she had just heard. Rebecca Sutherland's face had gone from pale to ashen. She understood with the acute awareness of an experienced trial attorney that the case had just fundamentally shifted. The silent child had found her voice, not to accuse, not to provide detailed testimony, but to make the most fundamental plea that any victim could make. "Help me." Those 2 words were more powerful than any comprehensive testimony could have been. They were the raw, unfiltered cry of a child in pain reaching out for rescue. Judge Morrison raised her hand, signaling for silence. "The record will reflect," she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion, "that at 9:47 a.m. on October 15th, the minor child, Emma Marie Patterson, has for the first time in 4 months made a verbal utterance. The child stated the words, 'Help me,' directed toward the victim services dog present in this courtroom." She paused, her eyes moving from Emma and Ranger to Jennifer Patterson to Rebecca Sutherland and back to Emma again. "This court is taking a brief recess. We will reconvene in 15 minutes. During this time, I expect that everyone involved in this case will reflect carefully on what we have just witnessed." The bailiff stood, announcing the recess, but nobody moved. Everyone remained frozen in place, processing the profound implications of what had just occurred. Emma continued to rest against Ranger, her small hand still stroking the dog's fur. Ranger remained perfectly still, providing the anchor of safety that this child had finally been able to access. Detective Webb stood quietly in the background, one hand resting gently on Ranger's back, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. He had brought his partner to this courtroom knowing that Ranger had the capacity to help this child, but even he was moved by the power of what had just unfolded. 2 simple words, "Help me," spoken by a 3-year-old girl into the fur of a German shepherd, had accomplished what months of legal proceedings, expert testimony, and professional advocacy had not been able to achieve. The child had found her voice. The 15-minute recess that Judge Morrison had called stretched into 40 minutes. In her chambers, the judge sat alone with her thoughts, processing the seismic shift that had just occurred in her courtroom. She knew, with absolute certainty, that she had just witnessed something that would stay with her for the rest of her judicial career. The image of that small girl whispering, "Help me," into a dog's fur would haunt her dreams and inspire her decisions for years to come. She made notes on her legal pad, documenting her observations and her preliminary thoughts on the case. She understood that whatever ruling she made today would need to withstand scrutiny, to be legally defensible, to be grounded in more than just emotional response to a powerful moment. Meanwhile, in the hallway outside the courtroom, a very different kind of activity was unfolding. Patricia Hoffman, Emma's court-appointed guardian, had immediately contacted Dr. Sarah Chen, the child psychologist who had been evaluating Emma. Within minutes, Dr. Chen was on the phone, available for an emergency consultation. Patricia explained what had occurred in the courtroom, Emma's first verbal utterance in 4 months, the circumstances surrounding it, the profound shift in the child's emotional state. "This is significant," Dr. Chen said quietly, her professional tone belying her internal excitement. "The child has experienced what we call a breakthrough moment. Her nervous system has found a pathway to trust, to safety, to the possibility of healing. This is exactly the kind of opening that we need to build upon. With careful, trauma-informed follow-up, we may be able to help Emma continue expanding her ability to communicate and process her experiences." Patricia made an immediate decision. She approached Judge Morrison's bailiff and requested that Dr. Chen be allowed to observe the remainder of the proceedings and to conduct an emergency assessment of Emma during the lunch recess. Judge Morrison, when informed of this request, approved it immediately. She understood that the window of opportunity that had opened needed to be carefully and professionally managed. By the time the courtroom reconvened, word of what had happened had spread through the courthouse. Bailiffs whispered about it. Court clerks discussed it in hushed tones. A court psychologist who worked in the building stopped by the courtroom gallery, curious about the case that was generating such intense reaction. The media representatives in the back of the courtroom were frantically texting their editors, trying to figure out what had happened during the recess that was causing such visible emotion among the courthouse staff. When Judge Morrison returned to the bench, her expression was resolved and determined. She looked directly at Emma, still sitting in her small chair with her hand resting on Ranger's back. The dog remained beside her, an immovable source of calm in the emotional storm that surrounded them. "Before we continue with the proceedings," Judge Morrison said, "I want to ensure that we are proceeding in a manner that prioritizes the welfare and safety of the minor child. Detective Webb, I'm going to ask that Officer Ranger remain in the courtroom for the remainder of these proceedings. Ms. Hoffman, I'm permitting Dr. Sarah Chen to observe from the gallery and to conduct an emergency psychological assessment during our lunch recess. Is there any objection?" Rebecca Sutherland stood, her mind racing through possibilities. She could object, but what would that accomplish? Objecting to the presence of the dog that had just helped the child speak would look terrible. It would look like she was trying to silence the victim. It would damage her case irreparably. She remained silent and sat back down, her jaw clenched. Judge Morrison continued, "Now, I want to address something that I believe is critical to understanding this case. The minor child has, for the first time in 4 months, spoken. Her words were 'help me.' This utterance, made in response to the presence of a trained victim services dog, provides us with critical information. The child is communicating through her actions and her words that she is in distress and requires assistance. This is information that cannot be ignored." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The question before this court is not whether this child has experienced trauma. The medical evidence makes that abundantly clear. The question is not whether this child requires protection. Her own words have answered that question. The question before this court is what action will best serve the interests of this child's safety, welfare, and long-term recovery. Over the next 2 hours, the proceedings took on a dramatically different character. The prosecutor's representative called additional witnesses, a substance abuse counselor who testified about the neurobiological impacts of addiction on parenting capacity, a child development specialist who discussed the critical importance of safety and stability in the first 5 years of life, a social worker who detailed the specific indicators of abuse that had been documented in Emma's case. But more importantly, the courtroom's emotional climate had fundamentally shifted. Everyone now understood that they were not debating abstract legal questions or weighing ambiguous evidence. They were determining the fate of a real child who had just found the courage to ask for help. The power of that moment continued to reverberate through the proceedings. At noon, Judge Morrison called a lunch recess. During this time, Dr. Sarah Chen conducted an emergency psychological assessment of Emma in a quiet conference room adjacent to the courtroom. What she found was remarkable. With Ranger present, Detective Webb had brought the dog to the assessment. Emma demonstrated a marked decrease in her baseline anxiety. She was able to sit still for longer periods. She made intermittent eye contact. Most importantly, she demonstrated a willingness to engage in communication, albeit still quite limited. Dr. Chen asked Emma simple questions using a specialized protocol designed for severely traumatized children. "Does your body feel safe right now?" Emma nodded slightly. "When you see Officer Ranger, what do you feel?" Emma was silent for a moment, then whispered, "Good, safe." 2 more words. The gateway was widening. "Emma," Dr. Chen said gently, "I know that things in your home made you feel scared. I know that grown-ups hurt you. And I want you to know that it was very brave of you to say, 'Help me,' in the courtroom. That was very, very brave. You did the right thing by asking for help." Emma's small face crumpled. Tears began to stream down her cheeks, not the tears of panic or fear, but something different. These were tears of release, of finally being acknowledged, of having her pain recognized as real and valid by an adult who believed her. When the courtroom reconvened at 1:30 p.m., Dr. Chen presented her emergency assessment findings to Judge Morrison. She testified that Emma showed clear signs of severe trauma consistent with abuse and neglect. She testified that Emma's ability to communicate, limited as it was, appeared to be improving with appropriate support and safety. Most critically, she testified about the neurobiological importance of consistent, safe, loving caregiving for a child who has experienced trauma. "Your Honor," Dr. Chen concluded, "this child has just taken an enormous step toward healing by finding her voice. That voice is asking for help. The question now is whether this court will answer that plea. Returning this child to the environment from which she was removed would be, in my professional opinion, not just inadvisable but potentially catastrophic to her psychological development and her safety." Rebecca Sutherland stood to cross-examine Dr. Chen, but her questions seemed hollow now. Everything that the defense had built its case upon, the ambiguous medical findings, the unclear evidence, the silent child who couldn't testify, had been undermined by 2 simple words spoken into a dog's fur. The defense was fighting a battle that had already been lost. By mid-afternoon, as closing arguments began, it was clear that the trajectory of the case had fundamentally shifted. The prosecutor made an impassioned closing argument about protecting children, about the court's responsibility to shield vulnerable people from harm, about the significance of Emma's breakthrough in revealing her need for safety. Rebecca Sutherland made her closing argument with considerably less conviction than she had begun with that morning. She spoke about the importance of family reunification, about the possibility of parental rehabilitation, about the need for due process. But even she seemed to recognize that these arguments, while legally sound in the abstract, rang hollow in the face of a child's genuine plea for help. Judge Morrison took the case under advisement for 24 hours, but indicated that she expected to have a ruling the following morning. As the courtroom was dismissed, Emma remained sitting with her hand on Ranger's back, the dog's presence having become her anchor to safety in this confusing, frightening legal process. The Harrigan family's home was located in a tree-lined neighborhood on the north side of Columbus, in an area known for its well-maintained houses, quiet streets, and strong sense of community. The house itself was a modest 2-story colonial with pale blue shutters and a wraparound porch where a wooden swing creaked gently in the autumn breeze. Inside, the home was filled with the comfortable warmth of a space that had been lived in by people who understood the importance of safety, stability, and unconditional love. Sarah and Michael Harrigan had been foster parents for nearly 15 years. They had successfully raised 6 other children from difficult circumstances, and 3 of those children had ultimately been adopted into the family permanently. Sarah was a former elementary school teacher who had left her profession specifically to focus on foster care and adoption work. Michael was a carpenter who worked flexible hours, allowing him to be present in the home during crucial moments. Together, they had created an environment where traumatized children could begin the slow, difficult process of learning to trust again. Emma arrived at the Harrigan home on a gray February afternoon, exactly 2 weeks after Judge Morrison's ruling had been issued. The judge's decision had been decisive and unambiguous. Custody was awarded to the Department of Children and Family Services, with placement in a carefully selected foster home. Parental visitation was suspended pending completion of a rigorous rehabilitation program that Jennifer Patterson would need to undertake if she ever hoped to regain custody. The judge had made it clear that this was not a permanent termination of parental rights. That would come later if Jennifer failed to meet specific milestones. But for now, Emma's safety and stability were the court's paramount concern. Sarah Harrigan had been specifically selected to provide Emma's foster care because of her expertise in working with severely traumatized children. When Emma arrived, carrying a small suitcase containing the few possessions she had been able to gather from her previous life, Sarah knelt down to the child's level and spoke with a gentleness that seemed to immediately communicate safety. "Welcome home, Emma," Sarah said, smiling warmly. "We're so glad you're here. We have a special room all ready for you, and I want you to know that everyone in this house is here to love you and keep you safe. You're going to be okay." Emma, still largely nonverbal despite her breakthrough in the courtroom, simply nodded. She was holding her small doll, the one she had been clutching during the hearing. Sarah gently took Emma's hand and led her into the house. What happened over the next several months was a transformation so profound that it seemed almost miraculous to those who observed it. Within the first week, Sarah and Michael made a decision that would prove crucial to Emma's healing. They visited a local animal shelter and adopted a rescue dog, a golden retriever mix named Scout, who had himself experienced neglect and abuse before being rescued. Scout was approximately 5 years old, with a gentle temperament and a way of understanding suffering that seemed almost preternatural. The introduction between Emma and Scout was carefully orchestrated. Scout was allowed to approach Emma slowly, without pressure or demand. The dog seemed to understand instinctively that he was meeting another being who had experienced pain. He didn't jump or lick aggressively. Instead, he simply sat near Emma, offering his presence without expectation of response. Emma, remembering her experience with Ranger in the courtroom, responded to Scout with a tentative reaching out. Her small hand touched the dog's golden coat, and something shifted in her expression. Over the following weeks, Scout became Emma's constant companion. The child and dog developed a bond that transcended typical pet ownership. Scout seemed to understand Emma's nightmares and would position himself on her bed during her sleep, his warm presence providing comfort when night terrors jolted her awake. Emma, in turn, began to talk to Scout in ways she wouldn't talk to humans. She would sit with the dog in the backyard, whispering her fears and her pain into his fur, finding in his unconditional acceptance the permission she needed to begin processing her trauma. Sarah Harrigan, watching this unfold, recognized it as a critical component of Emma's healing. She worked closely with Dr. Sarah Chen, Emma's trauma therapist, to integrate Scout into Emma's therapeutic process. Dr. Chen approved of the relationship, understanding that Emma's ability to trust and communicate with Scout was building neural pathways that would eventually extend to her ability to trust and communicate with humans. By April, just 3 months after arriving at the Harrigan home, Emma had begun attending preschool at a small, nurturing program specifically designed for children with special needs and trauma histories. Her first day was difficult. She cried when Sarah left her, and the teachers had to work hard to redirect her anxiety. But by the second week, something remarkable began to happen. Emma started to make friends. A boy named Tyler, who was naturally kind and patient, took Emma under his wing. A girl named Jasmine, who had her own history of trauma, seemed to understand Emma's struggles without words being necessary. By mid-May, Emma was speaking in short sentences, still not as much as a typical 4-year-old, but increasingly confident in her ability to communicate. She would tell Sarah about her day at school. She would ask questions about things she didn't understand. She would even, occasionally, laugh, a sound that had been largely absent from her life until now. One afternoon in late May, as Sarah was driving Emma home from school, Emma suddenly said something that made Sarah pull the car over because she was crying too hard to drive safely. "Mommy Sarah," Emma said, using the term she had begun using to distinguish Sarah from her biological mother, "I like my life now. I like Scout. I like school. I like you and Daddy Michael." Sarah had to pull off the road because the emotion was overwhelming. This child, who had been so profoundly traumatized that she couldn't speak, who had been starving and beaten and neglected, was expressing contentment. She was expressing gratitude. She was expressing the capacity to love and to receive love. By her 4th birthday in June, Emma had undergone a physical transformation as well. She had gained 8 pounds through proper nutrition and consistent care. Her hair, once matted and dull, was now shiny and well-maintained. Her eyes, which had held such haunted emptiness, now sparkled with curiosity and personality. She had developed a love of art and spent hours at the kitchen table creating colorful drawings with markers and crayons. During the summer months, Sarah began preparing Emma for the possibility of permanent adoption. The process would take time. The court required that a minimum of 1 year elapse before parental rights could be terminated, and Jennifer Patterson was theoretically still in the process of completing her rehabilitation program. But Sarah and Michael had already made the decision that Emma would become their daughter permanently, regardless of how long the legal process took. In July, Detective Webb and Officer Ranger visited the Harrigan home. It was a visit that Emma had been anticipating with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. When she saw Ranger, her face lit up with joy. She ran to the dog and threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur just as she had in the courtroom. "Hello, little friend," Webb said warmly, scratching behind Ranger's ears. "You've grown, you look so much healthier. How are you doing?" "I'm doing good," Emma said clearly, pulling back from Ranger. "I have Scout now. He's like Ranger, he helps me feel safe. And Mommy Sarah and Daddy Michael take care of me. I go to school. I have friends." Webb felt tears threatening to spill from his eyes. This was why he did this work. This was why he and Ranger spent their days walking into courtrooms and crime scenes and trauma-filled situations. This moment, seeing a child who had been so profoundly broken now thriving, now speaking, now capable of joy, made every difficult case, every heartbreaking story, every moment of secondary trauma worthwhile. In August, as the summer was winding down, Sarah made a decision to take Emma to meet with Dr. Chen for a comprehensive psychological evaluation. The results were astounding. Emma's trauma responses had decreased significantly. Her anxiety levels, which had been off the charts when she first arrived at the Harrigan home, had normalized considerably. She demonstrated age-appropriate social skills and emotional regulation. She showed resilience and a capacity for joy that belied her painful past. "Emma has made remarkable progress," Dr. Chen reported to Sarah and Michael. "What she has experienced is still part of her story, and she will likely need ongoing therapy to fully process that trauma. But she is demonstrating all the signs of a child who is healing. She has found safety. She has found love. She has found people and animals who believe in her and support her growth. These are the foundations upon which genuine healing is built." By fall, Emma was thriving in kindergarten, a year ahead of her chronological age, having made up much of the developmental delay that had resulted from her early deprivation. She was reading simple books. She was making friends. She was confident and curious. She was, in every measurable way, becoming the thriving child that she should have been all along. 5 years had passed since that pivotal October morning in courtroom 7B, when a 3-year-old girl whispered 2 words into a dog's fur and changed the trajectory of victim advocacy in America. Emma Patterson was now a confident, articulate 8-year-old girl standing on a stage at the Hilton Columbus downtown, addressing an audience of nearly 300 legal professionals, social workers, law enforcement officers, and victim advocates gathered for the 3rd Annual National Victim Advocacy Conference. She wore a navy blue dress that Sarah Harrigan had helped her pick out specifically for this occasion. Her blonde hair, now shoulder-length and carefully styled, fell in soft waves around her face. Behind her stood Detective Marcus Webb and Officer Ranger, the dog now graying slightly around the muzzle, still radiating the same calm competence that had defined his career. To Emma's left stood Sarah and Michael Harrigan, beaming with pride at their daughter. To her right stood Dr. Sarah Chen, the trauma psychologist who had guided Emma's healing journey. "My name is Emma Patterson," she began, her voice clear and strong, projecting to every corner of the auditorium. 5 years ago, I couldn't talk. I was scared all the time. I lived in a place that wasn't safe, and I didn't know how to ask for help. But then I met Officer Ranger, and he helped me find my voice. The audience was utterly silent, captivated by this girl who embodied the transformation that victim advocacy could achieve. "I want to tell you about that day in the courtroom," Emma continued. "I was so scared. I could see my mom and I didn't feel safe. My body was shaking and I thought I was going to get sick. But then Detective Webb brought Ranger into the courtroom and Ranger sat next to me. He didn't make me talk. He didn't ask me questions. He just sat there and let me know that I wasn't alone. And when I touched his fur, something changed inside me. I felt like maybe I could be safe. And I said, 'Help me.' Those were my first words in a very long time." She paused, and several people in the audience were openly crying. "Because I said those words, grown-ups listened to me. They believed me. They kept me safe. Now I live with my forever family, and I have a dog named Scout, and I go to school, and I have friends, and I'm happy. I wanted to come here today to tell you that what you do matters. When you help children like me, you're not just solving a case. You're changing a whole life." The applause that erupted was thunderous and sustained. Emma looked back at Ranger and smiled, and the dog seemed to recognize that this moment was significant, tilting his head slightly in what appeared to be acknowledgement. After Emma's testimony, Detective Webb took the stage to discuss the formal results of the Trauma Response K-9 program that had been established in the wake of Emma's case. The statistics were remarkable. In the 5 years since Judge Morrison's groundbreaking decision to allow Ranger in the courtroom, 12 additional states had implemented similar programs. Over 240 children had been successfully helped to communicate their experiences with the assistance of trained trauma response dogs. Conviction rates for cases involving child victims had increased by an average of 34% across all participating jurisdictions. Perhaps most importantly, children who had been helped by trauma response dogs showed significantly better long-term psychological outcomes than children who had gone through the legal process without such support. Emma's courage in that courtroom, Webb told the assembled professionals, wasn't just about her healing, though that was certainly important. It was about opening a door for countless other children who couldn't speak, who were too traumatized to communicate their experiences, who needed something beyond conventional legal procedure to find their voice. Officer Ranger and I are honored to have been part of that moment, but the real credit belongs to Judge Morrison, who had the vision to try something unconventional, and to Emma herself, who was brave enough to reach out for help. The conference also featured a panel discussion about the legal implications of Emma's case. Judge Patricia Morrison herself participated, discussing how the case had challenged her thinking about victim advocacy and the responsibility of the courts to ensure that justice served not just the letter of the law but its spirit. "I was a younger judge," Judge Morrison reflected. "I believed that the law was about evidence and testimony and argument. I believed that emotion had no place in judicial proceedings. But Emma's case taught me something fundamental. Justice without compassion is not justice at all. Sometimes the most important evidence is not presented through words or documents. Sometimes it's presented through the simple human, or in this case, canine, act of one being reaching out to another and saying, "I see you. I believe you, I will help you." In the years following Emma's public testimony at the conference, her story became the subject of extensive media coverage. A major news network produced a documentary titled Two Words, How One Child Found Her Voice, which won several journalism awards. The documentary followed Emma from her traumatized silence through her healing journey with the Harrigan family, interspersed with interviews with the legal professionals, social workers, and law enforcement officers who had been involved in her case. The documentary had a profound impact on public consciousness. Victim advocacy programs received increased funding. More law enforcement agencies invested in training trauma response dogs. Universities began incorporating Emma's case into their law school curricula and social work programs. Child welfare agencies across the country began examining their own protocols to ensure they were trauma-informed and child-centered. Perhaps most significantly, Emma's case became the foundation for legislative change. The Emma Patterson Child Victim Advocacy Act, passed by the Ohio legislature in 2027 and subsequently adopted by 7 other states, formally recognized the role of trained animals in victim advocacy and provided funding for training programs. The legislation specifically cited Emma's case as the impetus for the law. But beyond the statistics and the legislative changes and the national attention, Emma's most profound legacy was personal. She had become an ambassador for victim advocacy, speaking at schools, at law enforcement training academies, and at conferences. She had become a mentor to other children who had experienced trauma, demonstrating through her own example that healing was possible, that finding one's voice was possible, that a life of joy and purpose was possible even for those who had experienced profound pain. In her personal life, Emma flourished. By age 8, she had been formally adopted by Sarah and Michael Harrigan. Her legal name changed officially to Emma Sarah Harrigan Patterson in recognition of both her past and her present. She excelled academically, demonstrating a particular passion for reading and writing. She had developed a close friendship with Officer Ranger, and the dog continued to visit her regularly, a living connection to that pivotal moment in her life. Scout, her own dog, had become an integral part of her healing and her identity. Emma had even begun to explore the possibility of becoming a victim advocate herself when she grew older, inspired by the people who had saved her. Detective Webb continued his work with Ranger until the dog's retirement at age 10. Ranger had helped over 120 children find their voices and their paths to healing. When he finally retired, it was to live with Detective Webb and his family, spending his final years as a beloved pet rather than a working dog. His retirement ceremony at the Columbus Police Department was attended by dozens of children whose lives he had touched, including Emma, who presented him with a special award for service to vulnerable children. Judge Patricia Morrison, inspired by Emma's case, became a national leader in trauma-informed judicial practices. She established a training program for judges interested in implementing child-centered approaches to cases involving young victims. She wrote articles for legal journals. She consulted with other courts across the country. Her career, in many ways, found its truest purpose in the wake of Emma's case. Dr. Sarah Chen built upon her work with Emma to develop a comprehensive protocol for integrating animal-assisted therapy into trauma treatment for young children. Her research was published in peer-reviewed psychological journals and became standard practice in trauma-informed therapy clinics across the country. As for Emma herself, she often reflected on that October morning in the courtroom, on the moment when she had found the courage to whisper, "Help me," into a dog's fur. She understood, with a wisdom that seemed beyond her years, that those 2 words had been a turning point not just for her, but for countless children who would benefit from the systemic changes her courage had inspired. At her high school graduation, more than a decade after her rescue, Emma delivered a speech to her classmates about resilience, about the importance of speaking up, about the power of compassion and unconditional love. She spoke about the people and the dog who had saved her life. She spoke about her journey from silence to voice, from fear to safety, from despair to hope. "I am living proof," she concluded, "that even when things seem impossible, even when you think you'll never recover, even when your voice has been stolen from you, there is always hope. There is always someone willing to listen. There is always a path to healing. All you have to do is find the courage to ask for help." The auditorium erupted in applause. In the back of the gymnasium, Detective Webb sat with his family, his hand resting on the head of an aging ranger, tears streaming down his face. Sarah and Michael Harrigan stood and cheered, their love for their daughter evident in every gesture. And somewhere in the audience sat Judge Morrison, Dr. Chen, and dozens of other professionals whose lives had been forever altered by a child's courage and a dog's compassion. Emma's story, which had begun in darkness and silence, had become a beacon of light for an entire system dedicated to protecting vulnerable children. 2 words, "help me," had changed everything. And in changing Emma's life, those 2 words had changed countless other lives as well, creating ripples of healing and hope that would continue to spread outward for generations to come. The end.